Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where we are asking the question, whether PoE won? What does the news about Path of Exile 2 being a completely separate game mean for those two trajectories, those two paths of the Exile? What can we extrapolate on? What can we theorize at the moment? And what can we hope for? What can we potentially be afraid of or worried about? What are some things that are reasonable to think about and be concerned about as the news has come out from Exilecon in 2023 that Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 are not in fact one game with two different campaigns as was advertised in 2019, but instead are two entirely separate games, two entirely separate campaigns, two different mechanical structures, and two different end games. So two different games. What does that mean for both games, for Path of Exile 2 and for Path of Exile 1? We've talked a lot about PoE 2 so far over the last couple of days, and now I want to focus a little bit more on what does PoE 2's existence mean for the Path of Exile 1 community. So with that being our discussion base, let's dive into today's topics. Having multiple games means that there will be multiple paths of the Exile. This has got a lot of different tentacles to it, a lot of different categories to it, so we're going to try and do a brief overview here. Different games means that both games will, in fact, have different mechanics. We've already seen some previews of this with gameplay footage. A lot of you that got to go to Exilecon and try out Path of Exile 2 or got to watch from the comfort of your homes or workspaces, you got to see that Path of Exile 2 has got some different mechanics. And I'm not just talking about visual mechanics in terms of the visceral experience of what it's like to play and look at the game. I'm talking about actual interactable and buildable structures inside the game that shape your choices and that inform your gameplay experience. So, for instance, we all can talk about having a dodge roll on the spacebar. This is now a very common trope inside the action RPG genre. The first game that I played like this that had a built-in move ability into the character, I think, was Wolcen several years ago, and that seems to now be the industry standard. It's kind of funny that Wolcen, that was for a while the meme and the joke inside the action RPG community, has now, you know, become the standard in terms of including a dodge roll, a jump bar, something like that. That's kind of interesting to see how kind of all the iterations of action RPGs that are coming out now are just assuming that you can jump, that you can dodge, that you can do a roll, that you can duck, dive, dip, and dodge, I think, are the 4 Ds. But anyway, it's interesting to note that in those mechanics, I would say that that's like a superficial mechanic. I mean, it is a big deal, but that's just like the first layer, the first wave of differing mechanics between Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2. We've got differences in terms of the economic systems and how we're going to roll and craft and build things. The fact that gold is now going to be a primary drop for the campaign, at least that's what we've been told so far. That's a pretty big difference. Like, getting early drops in Path of Exile 1 can reshape your ability as a character to use different leveling equipment, to bypass certain sort of intermediary states in your build progression and simply go from what you were starting with to then maybe progressing to your exact skill that you're going to play in the end game. And so having gold instead of, you know, orbs be a kind of a primary drop. Yes, you'll still interact with NPCs and be able to purchase things, but that's a difference in mechanics. It plays out in economics, but it's actually a mechanical side of things. Having a completely different passive tree is something to be excited about. Having completely different character models, something to be excited about. Having completely different classes. Again, I think these are a lot of these things as a separate game sounds really fun and really encouraging, but what does that mean for Path of Exile 1? What does that mean for this old model of Path of Exile that is no longer where the primary amount of work time, workflow, and work energy from grinding gear games is being put? The primary efforts are being put into Path of Exile 2. So what does that mean for Path of Exile 1? Like, is Path of Exile 1 just getting kind of scrappy leftovers? What's the game plan and the direction for Path of Exile 1 in light of all the excitement and all of the hype of Path of Exile 2? Like, as one commentator put it in one of our recent videos here this week, I think it was a great summary statement, so shout out to you who made the comment. Path of Exile 2 is the game Grinding Gear Games wants to make, and Path of Exile 1 is the game that Grinding Gear Games has to make, right? So different mechanics are showing that. They're revealing that. We've heard for years that there are certain item base types that couldn't be added into Path of Exile 1. It would just be too far beyond the scope. Well, now we've got a bunch of new base types in Path of Exile 2. So does that mean we'll ever see new base types introduced into Path of Exile 1? Probably not. Like, that puts a heavy, severe limitation on the design space of Path of Exile 1. If there's any new developments or any new archetypes, any new procedures, any new mechanics that Grinding Gear Games wants to introduce into the action RPG genre, then it's probably going to come out in Path of Exile 2. Why would you bring out your nice, shiny new thing to the old game? You'll probably bring it to the new game in order to draw and attract more folks. That's a pretty big design piece of conflict that a lot of us are feeling at the moment. Okay, in terms of gameplay, I've heard and seen a lot of people say, well, things were intentionally slowed down. That's a direct quote. Things were intentionally slowed down for gameplay at Exilecon for Path of Exile 2. That's fair to say that things were intentionally slowed down. It's also fair to say Ruthless slowed down things in Path of Exile 1, and players, for the most part, have not enjoyed Ruthless. I have enjoyed Ruthless. I loved playing Ruthless hardcore. It was one of the things that I had the most fun coming back after my hiatus from Path of Exile. I really enjoyed Ruthless, and so we're kind of stuck in this really interesting spot where some players are saying they really love Path of Exile 1, and they love the speed, and they love the economics, and they love the mechanics, but they're really excited for Path of Exile 2 to take a different mechanical, economical, and speed approach to the game. And it's like, guys, if you want to play PoE at a different rate of economy with some slightly different mechanics and a different speed, you've already got that opportunity. You got Ruthless at home, but nobody likes that, right? So there's the meme, like, you want to play slower Path of Exile? We have slower Path of Exile at home. No, we've got to have PoE 2. It really makes me think a lot of players who supposedly say that visuals aren't what draws them into games. It makes me think actually visuals are what draw a lot of people into games. It's the visuals of Path of Exile 2, not necessarily the gameplay that's exciting a lot of people. Then, of course, there's different players involved here. All of these different things that we've talked out so far, different mechanics, different economics, different gameplay, different speeds, all of these different components are going to play out into two different communities, as we clipped and as we previewed and as we showed in the short and then in the long form video discussing some of the topics about what's making me nervous, what's making me confused and disappointed with PoE 2, is that when you have two different games, you split community player bases. That's a direct quote from Chris Wilson from 2019 Exilecon. When you make a sequel to a game, it splits the community. This is going to split the community. Now, the solution to this, of course, is, I think, brilliant. I think if the decision is to go with two different games, which that's the decision, then to have offsetting leagues and release cycles, I think that's brilliant, right? So that way, ideally, if players do want to play Path of Exile 1 and play Path of Exile 2, they at least have a chance to do so. But again, if all of the new and exciting and innovative and really enjoyable, passionate work that GGG is going to pump out is going to be put into Path of Exile 2, what does that mean for Path of Exile 1? Like, sure, there's going to be leagues coming out for it, but are they going to be the same in terms of their theme with Path of Exile 2? Like, let's do a case study, just real quick. Different players are going to be attracted to different pieces of content. When Trial of the Ancestors comes out, that's the next announced league for Path of Exile, right? So let's just pretend that Path of Exile 2 was already released. Different players are playing these two different games, Path of Exile 1, Path of Exile 2. Does Trial of the Ancestors get released for both Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2? Will they be the same league? Probably not, right? Most likely not. You've got different development teams, you've got different games, you've got different systems, probably not the same theming, right? If they are two different themes, two different leagues that are being released, like then Chris Wilson's next statement that he made in 2019 at Exilecon about how essentially making a sequel means dumping 10 years worth of hard work and endgame products and endgame content, like that essentially has come true. Path of Exile 2 will have dumped everything. If they're not the same leagues that are released in PoE 1 as released in PoE 2, that means that you're kind of reinventing the wheel for all endgame content for PoE 2 and for the league format and for the league structure. Okay, so if we've got two different leagues and two different games that are releasing, again, this further splits the community. It further splits the community between two different games and two different presentations. And that, again, brings us back to the question of PoE 1. If we've got new and exciting ideas, is the PoE 1 team going to be allowed to run with that? Or are those ideas going to be ported over into PoE 2? Like, what are the limitations of what PoE 1 is going to be allowed to get away with doing in terms of creating hype and creating excitement and being a fun, creative game? Like, what are people going to be allowed to do? So much of the discussion around PoE 1 over the last 4 years has been, well, we're really trying to shape up Path of Exile 1 so that way it can line up with Path of Exile 2. That's what we've heard for 4 years with game development for Path of Exile 1. That's not true anymore. There's no longer that reasoning. There's no longer that explanation anymore. That doesn't exist because Path of Exile 2 is a separate game. So any changes that go on to Path of Exile 1, they should just be factoring in Path of Exile 1, right? We already know that hasn't been the case for a while. We don't know exactly when. But that means Path of Exile 1's getting designed with Path of Exile 2 in mind. So those two different player bases, they're going to have two very different experiences. And there is a very real question in my mind about what's going to be allowed, what's going to be permitted, what's going to be creative about what we see in Path of Exile 1 when all we've heard about is the limitations that Path of Exile 1 has had to experience because of Path of Exile 2. It makes me a little nervous about Path of Exile 1. Then, of course, there's different game design teams, right? So people who are working on Path of Exile 2 are not the same people who are working on Path of Exile 1. That's a split in terms of labor, in terms of creativity, in terms of the workforce. And so remember a while ago, I want to say it was 2016 or 2017. Many of you won't remember this because you weren't playing the game back then. But at that point in time, somewhere in that development cycle, it might have even been as late as 2018, there were essentially two teams that were working on releases and leagues for Path of Exile. And during those two different league cycles, they would take turns. There would be an A team and a B team. I've scrubbed the internet to try and find when this was. It was announcements. We covered it. I want to say it was during like Incursion, as well as during a couple of different leagues around that time. But there was an A team and a B team, and they took turns. They took cycles, right? So that way there was less of a push, less of a grind on the design teams that, hey, one design team has to come up with 4 new ideas every year. Instead, it was 2 different design teams would have to come up with 2 ideas. It was a brilliant solution to a labor work problem and towards a creativity problem. I think it was a great choice. And now we're seeing that now with 2 different games. So now you got 2 different games that are releasing essentially the same amount of leagues for each game. So instead of having 4 leagues, again, if these are separate leagues, as what we were talking about a moment ago, if each game, Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2, each have 4 leagues every year that are released, that's 8 leagues worth of content that are getting released for Path of Exile in general as a franchise and as a brand. That's a lot. That's a lot from a team that earlier was saying, hey, we're feeling the crunch and the grind of trying to have one team do 4. Now we're going to try and have 2 games and each of them do 4. It's going to be really, really interesting. Okay, let's get into some more details and expand some more of this discussion. For the last 4 years, we've heard a lot about Path of Exile 2 and 4.0 coming, the original promise being 1 game, 2 campaigns, a shared end game. All right, so almost all of the changes that have happened for the last 4 years, we as a community have taken those changes on and discussed them and engaged in conversations and evaluations of those changes with the hope goggles, the hope glasses on, that all of these things are preparing us for Path of Exile 2. In fact, it was yours truly who got a lot of pushback when Ruthless came out, and I said some dirty words to everybody. I said, guys, Ruthless is probably prepped for PoE 2. Everything after, I think it was after Delirium. I think that was 2019, right? 2019, and then into 2020 was Delirium. We said after Exilecon, when they said Path of Exile 2 is going to come out and that's going to be 4.0, we said everything that's going to happen now in terms of design and in terms of changes is all in preparation of that. Well, that theory still stays true. All the changes that have happened in PoE 1 have been about all of the changes for PoE 2. But those changes now have been made in a Path of Exile 1 environment. That's kind of strange. That's kind of weird. For those of us who have enjoyed Path of Exile 1 over the last 4 years and the years prior, if the whole game has been pulled in a direction to make it more like Path of Exile 2, well, one of the reasons to do that was because they were going to be one united game. If they're going to be 2 separate games, you actually want them to be distinct games, right? You don't necessarily want them to have too much overlap. Otherwise, players genuinely do get burned out with the brand and the franchise, etc., and they don't play both games. You lose hours on it. You lose monetization on it, you lose promotion on it, etc. So ideally, Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 are a separate and distinct enough game that players enjoy both of their experiences for the unique experiences that they are. Well, then all the changes that have happened over the last 4 years to make PoE 1 more prepared for PoE 2, that's really frustrating. Because now if they're separate and distinct games, like, there's no other way to say this. I'll just say it in the shortest format I possibly can. I want my PoE 1 back. I want PoE circa 2020 to 2021. I want it 2019, 2018, 2017. Like, those 5 years, that's the heyday of Path of Exile, in my opinion. Now, we're all going to have a different opinion about that. And plenty of people can say, well, oh, Iron, that's just like your opinion, man. And who really cares about your opinion? I agree with you. Who really cares? I don't even care all that much about my opinion. My children certainly don't care about my opinion. My wife, who loves me very, very much, she's very kind, and she does oftentimes care about my opinion. But besides for that, who really cares about my opinion on these things, right? So take my opinion out of it. What is PoE 2? And what is PoE 1? Are they genuinely two distinct entities? We're getting promotionals, we're getting teasers, we're getting previews, we're getting statements. PoE 2 is a separate game from PoE 1. All right, so where does that leave PoE 1? Why does PoE 1 need to cozy up and get as close to the vision for whatever PoE 2 is going to be as possible? Why? If there's a problem with Path of Exile 1, and that problem is the speed of gameplay, well, that's not a problem anymore. You've got a different game if you want to play a slower version of Path of Exile. You can play it in Ruthless, and you'll be able to play it in Path of Exile 2. Well, economically, there's problems with Path of Exile 1. Okay, so we have a market house and a merchant house and an auction house that's coming to PoE 2? No, that ain't happening. Okay, so what economically is being solved? Well, we're bringing gold to Path of Exile 2. Okay, that's a difference. So why is it that we're restructuring and reframing a lot of the ways how orbs are used in Path of Exile 1? And why are we taking away certain orbs? Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I was excited as anybody in 2019 when they said, hey, fusings are going the way of the dodo bird. We're getting rid of fusings. At the same time, a lot of the changes that have gone on and a lot of the theory crafting that we've all been engaged in as a community and discussing have been that PoE 1 was going to be incorporated into PoE 2. We don't have that anymore. So is the gem system from PoE 2 coming to PoE 1? Are we still going to have the old link system in PoE 1? Is that still going to be around? Like, in what ways will PoE 1 and PoE 2 be separate games and be distinct? We get that visually and viscerally, there's going to be a different gameplay feel to PoE 2 because of the campaign, because of the mechanics. But how many of those mechanics are going to come to PoE 1? Well, the answer could be none. The answer could be some. The answer could be all of them. Like, what does this mean for PoE 1? What do all the changes that were in preparation for PoE 2, what do all those changes mean about PoE 1? I read a thread the other day. I can't find it anymore. My apologies. I even checked my history. I couldn't find the quote. Somebody asked a great question on the general discussion forums to say, hey, does this mean that 4.0 as a big update to Path of Exile 1 will ever truly come? And the answer at this point, I think, has to be, we don't know. Probably not. Because for years, the labor force at Grinding Gear Games has been working on Path of Exile 2, and that's fair. Again, please don't hear me at any point in time throughout any of these discussions saying anything that GGG is doing is unright or is evil or illegal or immoral or objectionable. No, I'm just trying to go, what does this mean for PoE 1? Is there ever going to be a big 4.0 release? We acknowledge as a community there are problems with PoE 1. And I would argue, and I think there are others like me who would also argue, that over the last 4 years, there have been more problems created in Path of Exile 1 because of gameplay design decisions that have changed to slow the game down, to bring in player power. Path of Exile 1, I don't play it because I want to play Dark Souls. I play it, and actually in a very similar way to how I play my sports games. It's because I want to go in and have this character creation of a power fantasy where I can just go in and destroy things instantly. That's really fun. And seeing my character grow and take shape in that, that's the story that I enjoy of Path of Exile 1. Going from a no-name on the beach to being able to wipe things out in split seconds and clear maps next to no time. I love that. That's exciting. That's fun. If you want to slow the game down and do a game differently, great, we got Ruthless. Great, we got PoE 2. But if we're impressing Ruthless and PoE 2 mindsets and speed onto Path of Exile 1, I'm going, okay, well, you're creating more problems for PoE 1 than you're solving. PoE 1's a distinct game. Players want it to be a distinct game. Designers want it to be a distinct game. So is it going to feel distinct? Are we going to get speed back? Are we going to get more of those creative, overpowered options? Like, one of the things that was so exciting about Path of Exile 1 for years was this was the overpowered, crazy Easter egg, discover it and break it and go have fun with it game. That was Path of Exile 1. Like, you can do things that are absolutely insane. You can focus around one specific stat and make it a silly character. You can do all sorts of different combinations, and somebody's going to look at your character and go, what is going on here? And then you run past them in a map. You can go in and blow up a boss because you've got a character that's got 1 HP, no defenses whatsoever, and you're just built as a glass cannon. You can do the reverse. You can go 0 DPS. Like, all of these different options and everything in between were available in Path of Exile 1. A lot of those things have changed over the years. More of character design has become streamlined. More things have simply become better, and more things have simply become worse because of so many different restrictions and so many different reworks, like to flasks, like to ascendancies, like to the passive tree, like to league design, like to itemization design. So many things, like to endgame expansion design. So many things have changed over the years under the auspice of Path of Exile 2 4.0 is coming. It's a separate game now. There is no 4.0 that's coming. So, about all those changes that were coming to PoE 1, like, yeah, what about those? Are those going to get reverted? Are we going to slowly grow back into that speed zoom game? Is there going to be that overpowered, let's create overpowered characters and have a great time doing it? Is that going to be the design philosophy of PoE 1? We just don't know at the moment. All right, here's a quote from Weiku Jitsu, who we've been buddies here on YouTube and on the forums for a long time. So thanks so much, Waco, for always dropping your great comments. I always love what you've got to say. And a lot of the times I disagree with it, but I always appreciate your thoughtfulness. So here's a quote from Waco on PoE 2, the Ruthless mode. So he says, first off, I just want to thank all the devs. It's been a very long time since you admitted you guys were wrong. I think we all wish you didn't wait so long to find out that no one is going to play your ruthless PoE 2 game. So you split it and let us have PoE 1, so at least you have some fan base left. That said, since you guys now have made the game you always wanted, can we have our game back? Pre-nerf harvest, betrayal, ultimatum, loot bonus. We want all the goodies, and we want more league mechanics to stay and at full strength. I know you guys don't like power creep, but we do, and I would really love to start buying supporter packs again. I know you guys think that if you allow power creep, then we will play less, and I am just so happy to tell you that just is so far from the truth. When we are happy and we are well fed, we play more. We make more different alternate accounts. We want to try and build and that dumb build over there. We want to try all these different things is what he's saying, all these alt characters. But when I grind for 2 weeks and barely have enough to make some crappy made grade boots, I'm not going to make a second character. No way. So stop it. Just stop it. Heck, last time you guys were still making us happy, I bought 2 times 60 supporter packs and just gave one away to a friend because I wanted to support the direction of the game. Now with all the nerfs and all the removed content. I mean, come on, you guys made Ruthless in the game you want. Now let us have our fun now, and we promise we won't laugh when no one plays Season 2 of PoE 2. I am not alone as the only person out here who is saying, okay, what about PoE 1? There's plenty more. There's threads. I'll link several of the discussion threads down below. I'm not going to read through all of them here today. I will read through some more quotes like this. But this is a great expression of frustration to go, where was that PoE that we played and that we fell in love with? And now what's going to happen to it moving into the future? Like, if Ruthless really is the game and Ruthless is the speed that PoE 2 is going to be at, there are a lot of people who don't like that game. There's a lot of people who don't like that speed. Now, the response is, and I can already hear it in the comments down below, well, Iron, that's being specious, that's being spurious. We don't know that that's going to be the speed. In fact, we've got quotes from people at Exilecon saying, well, the game has been, from Grinding Gear Games, higher-ups in the company, saying, hey, this has been intentionally slowed down so that way your character feels bad and it feels tough and it feels difficult. Okay, that's fine, but there's so much mistrust in the air right now from a lot of us that we're going, how can we trust that when you say this is just the game super sped down and the game won't be super sped down when it releases? How can we trust that at this point? 4 years ago, you said 2 campaigns, 1 game. 4 years later, 2 games, 2 end games, 2 separate games, not the same game. Okay, so if we can't trust you when you say one thing at one Exilecon, how are we supposed to trust you what you say at the next Exilecon? Like, the proof is in the pudding, and the proof is in what actually comes out. So when we have played Path of Exile, we who have played Path of Exile for the last 3 to 4 years, we're looking at league mechanics and we're going, leagues are getting worse. And more often, leagues aren't going core. Well, that's because of content bloat. Sometimes comes the pushback. No, sometimes it's not because of content bloat. Sometimes it's because very overpowered things are being introduced into the system, and GGG is going, no, this isn't about content bloat. This is about power creep, and we don't want players to have access to this power continuing moving forward. Okay, so to tease it out in a league format campaign is expressly there just to get a bump in player numbers for the league duration. That's all it's there for. It's not there for the long-term health of the game. It's not there for the long-term vision of the game. It's literally just there to go, here's something new and shiny and overpowered, and you only can get it during this league. That's what that is. Now, if leagues are designed to go core and are designed with the intention of being a part of the long-term expectation and game plan of Path of Exile 1, then they're going to be designed to hopefully go core. But the fact that a lot of things haven't been designed to go core in their various iterations and expressions makes me, again, a little nervous and think maybe there is no long-term future for PoE 1. Maybe the goal is PoE 2 does kill off PoE 1. I haven't said that so far up until this video. I've been waiting until now to say it. But maybe that is the plan and the case. Maybe the goal here is kill off PoE 1 and replace it with PoE 2. Now, a lot of folks are going to go, you have no evidence for that. You've got nothing from GGG that would cite that. Why on earth would you talk about that? Well, GGG is quite known for supporting things for a time and then moving their vision, changing their direction, and then only supporting something in the most moderate or modicum sorts of ways, right? So whether it's a new game type or a new game mode that comes out and then doesn't necessarily have new features added to it or expressed in it, thinking the guild system, for instance, thinking various quality of life things in terms of solo self-found or in terms of private leagues. Lots of different things are released by Grinding Gear Games, and they don't do a great job of always going back and refining and reworking those things. And we're seeing that play out on the grandest stage of the game and the franchise and the brand possible, which is we don't like things in PoE 1, so what's the way to fix that? We just release a whole new game. Okay, great. Where does that leave PoE 1? A whole lot of people out there are saying, well, don't worry, you can just play PoE 1 and play PoE 2. Okay, but what happens when PoE 1 doesn't have enough players to justify its continued support in comparison to PoE 2? Well, it would never get that way. And you know, it would never even get that way because, you know, if PoE 2 goes well, then the finances will be there to support PoE 1. Okay, but how are the finances of PoE 2 going to work out? Because we've been told that all of the stuff that we've purchased in PoE 1 is going to carry over into PoE 2. Well, boy, that makes me kind of nervous. How's PoE 2 going to make money? Is it just going to be through supporter packs and cosmetic transactions? Well, it's not going to be through stash tabs, maybe necessarily, but maybe there will be a new system. Maybe there will be something like a seasonal pass that's introduced, which we've already had introduced into PoE 1. Even though prior, there were long discussions about whether or not there would ever be a game pass, whether or not there would ever be pay-to-win elements inside Path of Exile. There's lots of free-to-play sort of reward elements that are there along that seasonal pass track. There's a lot here that's just making a lot of us who have played multiple games for multiple years go, there's a lot of industry questions to ask here about the separation of Path of Exile 2 and Path of Exile 1. There's a lot of questions. And that's on top of great questions like what Waco's asking, like, please give us our old PoE 1 back. All right, this is another quote here from Dichotomoris and Skujin. My apologies if I'm butchering both of your online handles. But the first quote is, Ruthless Mode has like 5 people playing it. If GGG makes PoE 2 like that, they'll have wasted a massive investment. GGG is a successful company that has produced an amazing game, Path of Exile. They are not idiots and are not going to shoot themselves in the face here. That's one of the arguments going against what Waco just said about, hey, PoE 2 is just going to be like Ruthless in terms of its product. Well, here's Skujutchen. Gris, again, I'm butchering your name. Somebody help me out in the comments about how to pronunciate this. Thank you much. The response is, they just did. PoE 2 is slow move speed. Refill flask in town? That's Diablo 4. PoE 1 has perfect refill system. Devs don't understand the game, really. Restart the zone when you die. Gonna get old fast as all mobs respawn. Kriparian sighed when he faced that, and he is the golden goose of Path of Exile play. If he sighed, devs messed up big time. Games feel like a job now. Devs don't understand if you play a game for 600 hours like Mathel does, these mechanics are going to be bad and more bad. PoE 2 is already a failure. Ruthless 2.0 design, and players do not want that. I don't see how there's any evidence to refute that Path of Exile 2 is just a further expressed imagination of Ruthless. I really don't see it. The evidence is there to say a lot of the stuff that's come in Ruthless mode, maybe the reason why people can't follow this argument is because people haven't tried out Ruthless mode. Maybe that's why. If you go and you play Ruthless, you will see, and then if you go watch the gameplay footage from Exilecon, from Path of Exile 2, you will recognize stuff from Ruthless. The speed, the damage, the repetition of abilities on the same monsters. Oh, doesn't that look cool? The battle is a lot more interactive now. It's because your damage is nerfed. It's because your support gems are almost non-existent unless you have played a whole bunch of characters on Ruthless and played for a whole bunch of hours. It's because your gear is garbage because there's almost nothing that drops. And even, again, the example of gold dropping in PoE 2 and gold dropping in Ruthless. Like, that was the chosen test ground where they wanted to test out PoE 2 at. So, the evidence is there to say, look, the gameplay speed that they're aiming for is something more akin to Ruthless than it is to regular Path of Exile. Like, I forget what my fastest character was when I was playing through Hardcore Ruthless, but it was a lot more than 8 hours to get through the campaign. All right. Now, some of that factors in that I was streaming. Some of it factors in that some of my characters just had awful luck in terms of their support drops, and their itemization. I get that. All right. Nonetheless, for me playing Ruthless, it was much slower than some of even my slow progressions through the 10x story campaign of PoE 1 in a regular environment, in a non-Ruthless environment, right? In a non-Ruthless environment, I'm pretty much 6 to 8 hours to get to maps on a league start without anybody interrupting me, okay? In a Ruthless environment, it's like 10 to 14 hours on a league start environment, depending on how things go. That's just what I've experienced so far in my few playthroughs of Ruthless. So all that is to say, is that what PoE 2 is actually aiming for? Is slowing things down. And again, the repeated comeback or retort to that argument is, no, things were just slowed down for showcasing everything. All right, again, how am I supposed to trust that? We literally have examples of things said in 2019 that are not true in 2023. How can we be sure that what's said in 2023 is going to be true of closed beta in 2024 and true of an open beta? We don't even know if the game will be released after closed beta. It might just go to open beta, and then release might come after that. So who knows when the actual release date may come, 2025, 2026? We don't know. This, again, all comes back to, what about PoE 1? Players who play PoE 1 and who don't play in a Ruthless environment, they want to play a fast game, get to maps, blow bosses up, and have awesome OP gear. That's what they want to do. They don't want to play with flasks that have to be refilled in town in a famine-like environment. Leave that to the private league players. So what is going to happen here with PoE 1? Are the design principles that are in play in Path of Exile 2, are they going to continue to be forced onto Path of Exile 1? Because we're seeing that. We saw the Flask rework. We're seeing Ascendancies reworked. We're seeing specializations get pulled off of Ascendancies and put onto the passive tree. We've seen that for years with multiple different specialities being pulled off of or pulled away from Ascendancies and put onto the passive tree. Now, overall, we can say that's a great design decision. But if that's because of Path of Exile 2, it's another thing that's going, these games aren't distinct. You're not making them two separate games. You're making Path of Exile 1 in the image of Path of Exile 2. And PoE 1 players want to enjoy PoE 1. We want it to be a distinct game. This is another quote here on the forums from Stormy Knight. And the post reads like this: since PoE 1 is now its own thing, can we have all this back? Here's just a quick list. 3.15 Harvest, keep the suffix and prefix. Scourge Krangler, the Synthesis Machine. Oh my goodness. Do you guys remember Synthesis? Do you remember yours truly who loves Synthesis? That is like peak Path of Exile, is being able to take rare items. You remember for years, like this is mind-boggling to me. For years, Grinding Gear Games has said, we can't figure out a way to solve the problem of making rares meaningful and making rares worth identifying again. They had it with Synthesis. They had a system where rares were worth identifying and trading and using in recipes. They had the system, and it didn't go core. The Crucible Forge with expanded support gem scope if no PoE 2 gem system is incorporated. The Old Beyond, duplication of maps and blueprints coming back. Old mana reservation, old cast when damage taken triggers, old cast on crit triggers, old spell self-casting, old melee animations and pre-nerf counters, old headhunter, old self-curse, old expedition gamble rates, old chance and mythic orb rates, old drop rates. Loot 2.0. It was better than what we have. Chris said it was too OP. Remember all those nicely rolled heist items? Threshold jewels that were lost and not added anywhere else to be brought back. Do you remember threshold jewels? They don't exist in the game anymore. Probably more too. Old fossil crafting. I'm sorry, they don't exist in the game anymore to the extent that they used to. There you go. There's a nuanced statement. Give me this and I'll play it till I die. I don't need any updates. Keep your PoE 2. PoE is the only action RPG game that lets you turn it up to 11. It's the only game where I can make a build like Worm Blaster or Hellemouse. I want a game where I can create a Scourge Synthesis Crucibled, perfectly rolled and harvested Doomblade of Godliness, where I right-click and lasers blow up the game from orbit. This is the game I like. This is the game they were making until they were not. I think there's genuinely just an amount of new excitement in the action RPG genre. Diablo 4, oh, I said the forbidden word. Anyway, there's other action RPGs out there that have been recently released that get people excited and get a whole new generation of people excited for the action RPG genre, and that's totally fine. It's fine to have competition in the space. It's fine to have multiple different games. The question is, how does all this relate back to PoE 1? All of these design decisions have been coming through the pipeline, dating way back to Harvest, dating even back to Synthesis. Synthesis was like 3.5 or 3.6 or 3.7. Anyway, like dating years back. Hey, there's problems in PoE and we want to limit power creep. Okay, but you have a separate game that you can limit the power creep on. Path of Exile 1 is just a mess. We don't want to have to go back in and rework everything. Okay, then you don't have to. Go do that in your PoE 2 and just let PoE 1 be a mess for the player base who wants to play it. Let it be the mess. Let people who want to go play action RPG Souls-like play Path of Exile 2. Let the rest of us who want to play actual Path of Exile, like Path of Exile of what it's looked like for much of the last decade, let us go play that. There's players who are going to play it. There's streamers who have built careers for themselves. Me, not so much. Others have built careers for themselves off of playing Path of Exile 1. Like, Path of Exile 1 is an industry unto itself. I'm not saying don't make Path of Exile 2. I'm not saying reverse the decision to make it a separate game. I'm saying give us Path of Exile 1 back. Make Path of Exile 1 what made Path of Exile 1 to begin with. Now, even that statement unto itself is controversial because there's a lot of players who played the game before I got super into Path of Exile who would say Path of Exile 2 is doing that. It's going back into a slower, a grindier, a more difficult spiritual successor to the Diablo franchise. And that's great. Path of Exile 2 can be that. I'm very concerned that the influence of Path of Exile 2 is going to continue to influence, shape, develop, and limit what Path of Exile 1 has been, as it has been, and what it will be in the coming future. Here's another quote from La Blue Girl. This is in the post called Poll, Did Exilecon Increase or Decrease Your Overall Hype for PoE and PoE 2? Answer, they just need to get this game out the door already. The gameplay reveal was almost 4 freaking years ago. That's just insane. And now we're still looking at a closed beta a year from now. If things work out, that is, which they haven't really so far. Something must have gone really wrong here. We're looking at what, a 7 to 8 year development time here for a pseudo sequel with lots of stuff already in place. I've been playing online games since the late 90s, and the only things similar to this are straight up vaporware and stuff that's been in development hell forever, like Star Citizen. I think this is a great point in terms of the development timeline, and it brings up, again, those questions about when exactly did the development team at Grinding Gear Games know Path of Exile 2 needs to be a separate game. Like, I've had some conversations with people who have said, well, why does that matter? Why does it really matter when GGG knew? It matters because when were they going to communicate that with us? Did they know that years in advance of Exilecon 2023? Did they only know that recently? Like, it seems to be that that's a pretty big deal. Now, I get that there's times to build hype and there's times to have a conference and a convention and use that in order to build momentum towards your next product. I get that. I'm sympathetic to it. Again, I'm not critiquing the product here, nor the process for releasing the product. What I'm saying as a consumer is, why didn't you let me know sooner? I might have been more excited sooner. If you're going to say, well, we had to hold off because we wanted to get closer to the release date. Well, 4 years ago, you let us know that this game was coming. And to be frank, it wasn't a game at that point in time. It was just an expansion to a game that already existed. It was 4.0. It was one game, two campaigns. So this brings up the question of what has happened. Now, I've got some answers to this. I do have some thoughts to this particular comment. One is, in the middle of this development cycle, the middle of this 8-year development cycle, including the last 4 years, we had something that was a pretty big deal, a pretty massive world-shaping deal, which was the lockdowns and the massive spread of COVID-19 during the 2020 calendar year. That was a massive change, right? And you heard, I hope nobody else who was more positive, more thankful, and more congratulatory to Grinding Gear Games for the masterpiece that was Delirium League that came out in the midst of COVID. And the masterpiece that was Heist League. I didn't like Heist unto itself. I didn't like how it all of a sudden pivoted from being marketed as a spy stealth game to then just becoming like a rush through sort of gameplay mechanic. But take that off. Heist was nonetheless, as a league, a masterpiece. And the game itself entirely was a masterpiece at that point in time. And that was designed while the entire gameplay development structure and rhythm of going to work each day was all thrown for a loop because of lockdowns in New Zealand. So that was incredible. That was a masterpiece. Like, Path of Exile may never have been at a greater peak. Like, in my opinion, Synthesis and then Delirium Heist. Like, those periods of time, not just those leagues, those aren't necessarily my favorite leagues unto themselves, but as an entire game, I don't think there was ever any leagues that I spent more time building more characters, playing and talking and thinking and being involved in Path of Exile than those 3 periods of time. And yet, what we're seeing here is the shift that was caused by those world-shaping events that nobody at Grinding Gear Games had any input on making those things happen, right? They're just dealing with the hand that was dealt them. That changes the development cycle of something. Maybe it was during that development cycle that conversation started to say, you know, maybe we can't actually work PoE 2 into PoE 1 like we were hoping. Maybe we've got to design this from the ground up as a completely separate game unto itself. Maybe that's when it was. But I completely agree with Le Blue Girl. We've had a massive, massive long hype cycle. And if there's anything that we know in the game industry, it's the longer your hype cycle is and the bigger hype you make, the bigger a megaphone you put to your mouth to say this game is going to meet all of your expectations and beat them all, then generally the harsher it's received and the worse critiques it receives, right? The longer and the bigger the megaphone that you use and the bigger the hype train you try and build, generally the harsher the reception something gets. Just take a look at most recent history. Look at No Man's Sky. Take a look at Cyberpunk. Take a look at the Fallout online games. There's just a million examples of this. When a game gets a gazillion bucks thrown at it to try and build a big hype train and a long timetable to try and say that the most epic and most world-changing, industry-shaping game is on its way, guess what? Players play it for like a week and then drop it. Okay? So Path of Exile 2 is suffering from that a little bit. It's suffering from this massive announcement that took place in 2019 and then not being able to deliver on it. A lot of people in 2019, you can go back and look at old forum posts. People were thinking 2021 or 2022. And so even with the lockdowns and the changes and the shifts that had to happen in 2020, maybe, just maybe, 2024 is kind of like a more realistic expectation from a consumer standpoint to go, okay, we'll give you a year or two extra because of how things got crunched during that world-altering time. At the same point in time, we're still hungry for it. We're still hyped for it. How long can people be excited for something and maintain that level of excitement for something without becoming critical? Like to say, where is the game? Where are we going to try it out? How does this all relate back to PoE 1? Well, we've been waiting for PoE 2 for so long. Path of Exile 1's just been languishing. It's been languishing. All of the leagues that have come out, I would say, since Heist, and the game state as an entire game has been a downgrade. Each and every one. Maybe not subsequently, maybe not a straight line vertical graph, going down. But in general, since 2020, things have not been the same. Maybe that's because a lot of the development team that was working on Path of Exile 1 shifted over to PoE 2. Maybe that means PoE 2 will be an awesome, epic, amazing game that is truly the sequel that everyone can be happy with. But probably not. And those of us who still want to play PoE 1, where does that leave us? Yeah, PoE 2 needs to come out if for no other reason than for the health of PoE 1, so we can have a direction and an understanding. Where's PoE 1 headed? We will get actual answers to that, not just verbal answers, but we'll see the proof in the pudding. We will only get answers to that when PoE 2 comes out. So it kind of means for a lot of us, we're kind of stuck in limbo for the next year or two as we're waiting for PoE 2 to come out. It's going to be really awkward. I'm excited for Trials of the Ancestors. I think there's a lot of things that could be promising about it as a league. But overall, it's got a track record of a couple years to go against the pattern of play, which is things are getting worse rather than things are getting better in PoE 1. It's got a lot to prove on that angle, all because we're waiting for PoE 2. Couple more quotes here. This one's from Mad Mossy. The answer to that same poll question, whether or not Exilecon increased or decreased hype. The answer from Mad Mossy is decrease, mainly because expectations were of something soon. Chris saying to get back early after Exilecon didn't help either. As it stands, PoE 2 is a year away, and the next league isn't for 3 weeks. So why exactly did people have to rush home? Does anybody remember that, by the way, to say, hey, get back home after Exilecon? Because, you know, we were thinking in the timeline when Exilecon was first announced that 322 would come up next. And there was even some discussion. We even covered it here a little bit on the channel. Maybe they'll surprise us and say, hey, here's a beta for PoE 2. Like, that was some of the tease. PoE 2 wasn't mentioned. 322's promised timeline wasn't promised at that point in time to say, hey, 2 days after Exilecon, we're going to release a league. But we were told, hurry back home. Don't stay in New Zealand too long. Like, why? Why include those lines in there? Anyway, continuing with the quote. I think why did Exilecon 2023 happen now? Was the expectation a year ago when it was announced that they'd have something more concrete to offer? With PoE 2 beta being a year away with release sometime after, Exilecon could have happened later this year or early next year with less time to wait. A year or more is just disheartening, and people will lose interest over time unless they keep the hype rolling with frequent updates. More importantly, for the immediate future, what is going to happen to PoE 1 now? PoE 2 was meant to fix everything, and it won't. We all know that. I've been trying to say that and lay the groundwork for that for years to say, look, let's not build up our expectations too much for PoE 2, for 4.0, because it can't solve everything. It just can't. Well, now that it's its separate game, it again brings us back to that question. What about PoE 1? What's going to happen for PoE 1? In the meantime, in these years while we wait for the beta, in these years while we wait for the open release of PoE 2, like who's actually working on Trial of the Ancestors? How many people are working on that? Who's working on whatever's next? What about the next big expansion for Path of Exile? Like, is Maven just going to be around? I was chatting with somebody earlier today who said, is Maven, like, is that just the end game now until PoE 2? Are we just sticking around with that? Is there going to be other end game expansions? What's that going to look like? There's a lot of good questions about PoE 1 while we wait for PoE 2. Here's another answer for Dreadlord Avatar. It's a short answer. It just says decreased, crushed about 4.0 hype. PoE 1 future hangs in the balance, a divided community, ultimately maintenance mode. You hear that? Ultimately maintenance mode. Do you know what games that are on maintenance mode are? When you get an email or an announcement, I know, who uses email? Yeah, insert your joke down below. When you get an update, a notification that says, such and such game is going to continue to be upgraded and maintained. Don't worry, you've heard news that we're making a sequel or that our developers are working on such and such. But we remain committed to keeping game X, Y, and Z open and sustaining its databases. Do you know what those emails and those communications are? Those communications, in the sports world, we call them the kiss of death. When an owner comes out, an owner of a sports franchise comes out and says, yeah, that coach is going to be my coach for years. And then like 2 weeks later, the coach is fired, right? When a game development company comes out and says, yes, we're going to support this game. We're going to maintain this game. We promise it's going to stick around even though we're developing such and such. Yeah, that means the game's about to die. That's what it means. You can go back and look at the track record. The evidence inside the industry is this is what happens to games when a sequel comes out. It's up to Grinding Gear Games to prove the opposite. And there's a lot of people who have a lot of trust in Grinding Gear Games over the years because they've earned it. They've done a great job of exceeding expectations, not just meeting them, but exceeding expectations. And so there is a lot of hope, I think, inside the community that what's being promised with PoE 2 will be delivered and that PoE 1 won't just die off. But the proof's going to be in the pudding. We've yet to see it. It is a very rare thing for ongoing games to be continually updated, continually developed, continually maintained. Now, some folks have all offered an alternate option to say, well, maybe PoE 1 won't be continually releasing leagues. Maybe they won't be continually updating. Maybe they won't be giving expansions. Maybe PoE 1 will be set in kind of like a stasis field with minor tweaks and minor updates every couple of months. Okay, that's the definition of maintenance mode. That's the definition of there's nothing new coming to the game. We know from the player numbers, people come back to Path of Exile when there's a new league launched. That's what Grinding Gear Games has taught people to do with their games. Come back and play them whenever there's new content. So if there's no new content for PoE 1, it's literally just a matter of time until the game is no longer viable, no longer financially worthwhile for all of the people who are behind the scenes making decisions to say, yes, let's keep maintaining that game. Let me bring up one more topic that I have not seen other people discuss on this issue. And this is the issue of all of the various game modes in Path of Exile 1 at the moment. In Path of Exile 1, you can play hardcore, softcore, hardcore solo self-found, softcore solo self-found. You can play in league format. You can play in standard format. You can play in private league format. You can also play these games in ruthless mode or in non-ruthless mode, okay? There's all these different formats, and I'm sure I'm forgetting one or two. There's all these different formats that you can play Path of Exile 1 in at the moment. When PoE 2 was announced, 1 game, 2 campaigns, there was still a hope that you'd essentially be able to do all the things that you'd want to do using the different campaign, Path of Exile 2, but still play the game in the way that you'd like to play. That there'd be an SSF ladder board, there'd be a hardcore ladder board, there'd be a softcore trading ladder board, there'd be private leagues, there'd be ruthless maybe potentially as well. And you know what? It's a separate game. Do we have an answer that all of these different features that currently exist in Path of Exile 1, that they are definitely going to come in Path of Exile 2? We just don't know. Are there more game modes that are going to come to Path of Exile 2 that aren't going to come to Path of Exile 1? What does that mean? Is there going to be multiplayer that is somehow shaped in Path of Exile 2? When Path of Exile 1 was first announced and first released, it did have some multiplayer kind of environments where you could go in and fight your characters, and it was a meme even as early as 2016 when I started really heavily playing Path of Exile. By that time, it was already a meme. Nobody played PvP. It was very, very rare to actually go in. You only did it because of daily missions. That was it. I think it was, and that was only for a relatively short time until the Masters were reworked. So people didn't go in and really do the PvP side of Path of Exile. But let's just do a potential hypothetical. Let's say PvP comes to Path of Exile 2 and it goes well. Would it come to PoE 1? There have been some really fun, like sideshow sorts of aspect of PoE 1 that have just been Easter eggs, like PoE Royale, right? Endless Delve. There have been some of these events that have come to PoE 1. Are those things going to come to Path of Exile 2? Will we get those things as full-on available formats to PoE 1 in the future? Or no? Will the dev team that's working on PoE 1 not have the time or not have the free reins to be able to design and develop those sorts of things? There's a lot of questions right now about Path of Exile 1, and all of it comes from the excitement and the hype and the tease and the news that Path of Exile 2 is a separate game. Well, thanks so much for joining us for the discussion today. As I promised earlier, I was going to give you more content than what you expected coming out of Exilecon. I wasn't able to stream during Exilecon, and again, I'm thankful for that because I don't think I would have been able to keep it together. I probably would have just shut down the stream and just been, more upset about things if I let the stream run. So I'm actually very thankful that I wasn't able to stream during Exilecon just because there's so many different questions, so many different uncertainties. But now here we are. We're a week out from Exilecon. Everybody should be home now from their Lord of the Rings vacations in New Zealand. What are your thoughts? I've given you a bunch of mine. I've shared a couple from the community. I'd love to know, what are your thoughts about Path of Exile 1 and its future? What hope do you have? What sort of dreams do you have? What sort of desires do you have as a community for Path of Exile 1? And for any of you who leaves me a comment, I recognize that not a lot of people are going to watch an hour-long video. I get it. But for any of you who leaves me the comment, it says, what are you worried about? You're getting more Path of Exile. Just calm down and enjoy the game. I just want you to recognize that's part of the issue. It's not just enjoying the game. The game has shifted. The game is a games as a service model. The game changes over time. Path of Exile 1, as of right now, is no longer what it has been and what many of us have fallen in love with. It's one of the reasons why many of us sometimes don't play, or we skip leagues, or we play less. It's one of the reasons why sometimes we play more and build lots of characters and don't skip leagues. We play leagues in multiple fashions. So just saying, well, you're just getting more of what you wanted. No, we don't know that. We don't know that. We don't know that if we're getting more of what we wanted when PoE 2 comes out, which is in a year, the closed beta. And so we don't know in the meantime what we're getting with PoE 1. We just don't know. I feel like there's a lot of pressure right now that's going to be placed on Trial of the Ancestors. I kind of feel bad for Trial of the Ancestors. It could be a great league unto itself. Like in a vacuum, this might have been a fantastic league that there's just a lot of excitement and a lot of hype and a lot of free-flowing expression and ideas and builds and community discussions that come out of Trial of the Ancestors. I kind of feel bad for it right now because it may be that if it doesn't go well, it may be that it gets overshadowed by this discussion about, well, what's PoE 1 going to look like? Like if 322 Trial of the Ancestors doesn't go great, a lot of people I think are going to go, hey, is this the future of PoE 1? Like, is this where we're aiming? Is this what we're doing? Anyway, we'll have patch notes for that later next week, and we'll be covering Trial of the Ancestors and all the news that comes out and all the hype. We'll give some league suggestion build videos as well as the time comes. So I'm excited for all that. I'm excited to try Trial of the Ancestors. I'm hoping that it's going to be a good league, and I'm hoping as a good league that it actually starts to bring back some of these things with PoE 1 because we now have an answer to the question, right? PoE 1, PoE 2, separate games. Let's make PoE 1 all the things that drew so many of us to it, which was the awesome, overpowered sandbox creative power creep game that it was. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. Thanks so much if you stuck around and made it all the way through the video. I really appreciate it. Make sure that you like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. And if you'd like to support the channel in any way, you can always do so by hopping over to Patreon. And at the end of the video, you'll even see your name in the future for the league that you have become a Patreon supporter. Anyway, thanks so much for joining us today. I hope the upcoming 322 Trial of the Ancestors and Path of Exile 2, if you play it, maybe, are there even Mirrors of Calandra in PoE 2? Anyway, I hope the upcoming league is the league, a Mirror of Calandra, drops for you. Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.